Let's go on to a second writer. This person, Pliny, was a politician and became governor of Bithynia, that's northwest Turkey in today's terms, around the year 112. He writes to the emperor talking about Christians and how he was dealing with Christians at the time, and of course asking the all-wise emperor to give him advice as to what he should do. So he talks about what he was already doing. I interrogated these people as to whether they were Christians. If they confessed, I interrogated them a second and a third time, threatening punishment. If they persisted, I ordered them to be led off. That means led off to execution. As for those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words given by me and prayed with incense and wine offerings to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought for this very purpose, along with the images of the gods, and also cursed Christ, which is said that no true Christian can ever be compelled to do, I thought they should be discharged. Well, you can see he's a pretty nice guy. His argument is this: don't kill everyone who's ever been called a Christian, only kill those who persist stubbornly to call themselves Christians once you threaten them. And there are some other tests that you apply to check that people aren't Christians. 3 in particular. They have to worship other gods, worship the emperor or Roman gods. The logic of that is, of course, that Christians are not willing to worship other gods. Also, they need to make sacrifices to these other gods. And then finally, they need to curse Christ. And I love this phrase which he adds, which is said that no true Christian can ever be compelled to do. Because, of course, here we have the governor of northwest Turkey writing to the emperor within about 80 years of the beginnings of Christianity, making the distinction between a true Christian and a Christian in name only. Isn't that fascinating? Within 100 years of it starting, of course, there are today, and there were back then, people who are Christians in name, and here we see that he's making the distinction, of course, having learnt that from Christians themselves. This is a slightly later stage from what we saw in Tacitus, where it's outsiders who call people Christians. Now, Christians at this stage, by the year 112, are willing to call themselves Christians, and also there are some people who are wanting to call themselves Christians even though they're not true Christians. But the logic of what he's doing is that Christians only worship one God. Now that's an interesting thing, because we know that Christianity began as a messianic movement. That's the whole idea. Christ equals Messiah. We know it began in Judea. We know from the New Testament, but we also know from other sources that Christianity began as a Jewish movement. Now let's just think about this. How many gods do Jews believe in? One. That's right. Jews only believe in one God. That's pretty important, because the logic behind this is you only worship that one being. That's going to be important when we see how the passage continues. He talks about a document which named people as Christians, denounced them as Christians, and said this: others named in the document said that they were Christians, but later denied it, saying that there had been, but they'd ceased 3 years ago, or many years ago, or even as much as 20. And so he then continues with what people who had ceased to be Christians described as going on in a Christian meeting. 3 years or even 20 years before. Well, let's think about that. If he's writing in the year 112, 20 years before gives us approximately the year 92. So here what follows is a description of a first century Christian meeting according to people who have renounced the Christian faith. Let's read about it. They said that this had been the full extent of their guilt or error. They'd been accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn. Great time to have a church meeting. Well, I guess if you've got slaves in your congregation, you better begin before they start work. And to sing antiphonally, that's one group to another, a song to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by an oath, not to some crime, but rather not to commit theft, robbery, or adultery, not to break their trust, and not to refuse to return a pledge when asked to do so. So a great emphasis on honesty we have in this meeting as well. But notice that they are singing to Christ as to a God. Now this document is in Latin, and there is no Latin word a, so it could be as to a God or as to God. We don't really know, but what we do know this is that Jews only worship one God. the logic of the first bit of the quotation is that they would only worship, the Christians would only worship one being. They won't just worship the emperor. So if they're worshipping Christ, surely the logic of it is this, that they have identified Christ as that one God. Now, some people have a view of how worshipping Christ arose, that it arose over a long period of time. Some sort of telephone game version. Now, I talked about the telephone game last year for any of you who are there who have seen that video. But the basic idea is this, that gradually over time people had more and more exalted views of Christ. And so at first they thought he was a very special person, then a very, very special person, then a very, very, very special person, then a very, 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 very special person, and then halfway to God, and then eventually 3/4 of the way to God, and finally God himself after hundreds of years. There is a mathematical problem with this, ladies and gentlemen. The mathematical problem is this. Jews cannot ever have 1.5 gods. It's not allowed. The total number of Jewish gods always has to add up to 1. Okay? That contrasts with Greeks. It contrasts with Romans. How many gods can Greeks and Romans have? Lots. It's not a bound set. If a Greek god looks down from the sky, sees a pretty woman, gets together with her, they produce offspring, then you've got another half god. You see, you just keep on going. But the logic of this passage is that the Christians would only worship one being, and look, they're worshipping Christ. So that's a striking thing that we can say in the context of getting to an argument about the resurrection. Then Pliny continues. Many people of every age, every rank, and of both sexes are being and will be called to trial. Nor is it only the cities that are affected, but the disease of this superstition is also reaching villages and ranches, farmsteads. It seems possible to check and correct this. It's pretty well agreed that the temples, which had almost become deserted, have now begun to be frequented again. And all the sacred rites which had been neglected for a long time are recommencing, and the flesh for sacrificial rites is being sold, for which, up to now, it was hard to find a purchaser. Now think about this. Governor of northwest Turkey, writing to the emperor within about 80 years of the beginnings of Christianity, saying so many people in his area had become Christians that the temples are almost deserted and no one's buying sacrificial meat. It's quite striking, isn't it? How many people became Christians? We also know it agrees with Tacitus how hard it was to be a Christian. We also know, by the way, it agrees with the New Testament, which tells you how hard it was to be a Christian. How many people became Christians? Look at the book of Acts. And then we're struck. Go to Acts chapter 19, and you will there read about the great riot there was in Turkey, in Ephesus, when so many people became Christians that the silver workers who made the idols that people worshipped were worried about their trade, the simple economic effects of people becoming Christians. Well, it's very similar to what we read here. Many, many people becoming Christians. Well, I've given